Time has a cruel way of showing us what is gold and what is merely gold-plated. For 25 years, Eleanor Vance believed she was holding solid gold, a marriage forged in shared struggle and polished to a brilliant shine by success. The truth, however, was revealed not by a touchstone, but by a ticking clock. The setting for this revelation was their 25th wedding anniversary party, a meticulously planned affair on the sprawling lawn of their Hamptons estate. Under the soft glow of fairy lights, amidst the gentle clinking of champagne flutes and the murmur of polite society, the empire of their marriage was about to be publicly dismantled. Richard Vance, handsome and radiating the easy confidence of a man who had conquered the world, tapped his glass for attention. A fond smile played on Eleanor's lips as she watched him, expecting the familiar rhythm of a speech she had heard in various forms for years, a tribute to their partnership, their journey. But the words that followed were not familiar. They were sharp, foreign, and they sliced through the celebratory atmosphere like shards of glass. Richard began with a toast to Eleanor, thanking her for the years, for the children, for being the foundation upon which he built his success. It was the perfect preamble, lulling the audience into a sense of warmth before he delivered the killing blow. "And it is on that strong foundation," he continued, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, "that I now must build a new future." A confused silence fell over the crowd. He then turned, his smile unwavering, and gestured towards a young woman standing near the orchestra. "I want you all to meet Isabella Rossi. She is my inspiration, my future." The announcement hung in the humid summer air, a declaration of war disguised as a love story. Gasps were stifled behind manicured hands. The festive murmur died, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable silence. All eyes, however, were not on the triumphant couple, but on Eleanor. And Eleanor did not give them the performance they expected. Her posture did not change. Her smile, a carefully constructed piece of social armor, remained perfectly in place, though it no longer reached her eyes. There were no tears, no tremor in her hand, no desperate plea. Instead, a profound and terrifying stillness settled over her. It was the calm of a dormant volcano, the quiet of a hunter who has just spotted its prey. She held Richard's gaze across the lawn, and in her eyes, he did not see heartbreak. He saw an appraisal, a cold, clear calculation that made the hairs on his arm stand up. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her own champagne flute, not in defeat, but in a silent, chilling acknowledgement. The gesture was a promise. Richard had just fired the first shot in a war he didn't even know he was declaring, against an opponent whose strength he had long forgotten he never possessed. The party was over. The real games were about to begin. To understand the frost that settled in Eleanor Vance's eyes that summer evening, one must look back not just hours, but decades, to the very bedrock of their life together. The Vance Corp that graced magazine covers and sponsored charity galas was not born in a gleaming high-rise, but in a cramped, two-bedroom apartment where the scent of cheap coffee and ambition hung heavy in the air. In those early days, Richard was the dreamer, the one with the dazzling smile and the unshakable belief that he was destined for greatness. But destiny requires a blueprint, and Eleanor was the architect. While Richard was out charming potential investors with stories of the empire he would one day build, Eleanor was at their small kitchen table, night after night, meticulously drafting the plans. She was the one who spent 6 months devouring books on tax law and zoning regulations until she could recite them in her sleep. She was the one who built the complex financial models on a primitive computer, projecting cash flows and identifying market vulnerabilities that seasoned professionals had missed. Their first major success, the acquisition of a derelict waterfront property that would later become a luxury condominium complex, was not Richard's brainchild. It was the result of Eleanor's tireless research into city development plans, a gamble she convinced a skeptical Richard to take, armed with a binder thick with data and projections. He made the speech to the bank, but he was reading her script. He shook the hands, but he was closing a deal she had engineered from the shadows. For years, this dynamic worked. They were a perfect, symbiotic entity. He was the face, she was the mind. He was the voice, she was the intellect that gave it substance. Eleanor never craved the spotlight. She found satisfaction in the quiet hum of a perfectly balanced ledger, in the elegant simplicity of a contract clause that protected them from all angles. She believed she was building a life, a family, a legacy. The company was named Vance Corp, a monument to their union. She saw no distinction between his success and hers. It was all one and the same. But success, like water, can erode even the strongest foundations. As the money poured in and their name became synonymous with wealth and power, Richard began to change. He started to believe the story he had been telling everyone for years. The line between the performance and the performer blurred until it vanished completely. He was no longer the charming frontman for his wife's strategic genius. He was, in his own mind, the sole visionary. Her late nights at the kitchen table were forgotten, replaced by the narrative of his gut instincts and daring risks. Her carefully crafted negotiation points became his impromptu flashes of brilliance in the boardroom. He would recount stories of their early struggles, subtly editing her out of the picture, recasting her role from co-founder to supportive spouse. "Eleanor was always so good at keeping the home fires burning while I was out slaying dragons," he would say at dinner parties, and people would nod approvingly. Eleanor heard these revisions, these tiny historical thefts. At first, she corrected him gently. Then she fell silent, telling herself it was unimportant. What mattered was the result, the life they had built. She didn't realize that in ceding the credit, she was ceding her power, allowing her presence in their shared history to become faint, like a photograph left in the Sunday. He began to see her quiet competence, not as a strength, but as a lack of glamour, a failure to match the glittering facade he had constructed around himself. Her practical advice began to sound like criticism. Her cautious warnings felt like a lack of faith in his Midas touch. This slow-burning fire of resentment was constantly fanned by one person, Richard's mother, Margaret Vance. A woman of modest origins herself, Margaret had spent her entire adult life clawing her way to the edges of high society. She was a connoisseur of appearances, a firm believer that the right name, the right dress, and the right daughter-in-law were essential assets. From the beginning, she viewed Eleanor with a thinly veiled disdain. Eleanor was intelligent, yes, but it was a quiet, bookish intelligence that didn't glitter at cocktail parties. She was steady and loyal, but she lacked the pedigree and socialite sparkle Margaret craved for the Vance dynasty. Over the years, Margaret's disapproval manifested in 1,000 tiny cuts. "That dress is very practical, dear," she would say, her eyes sweeping over Eleanor's simple but elegant attire. "Richard needs a woman who can command a room, not just balance a checkbook." She consistently praised her son's innate brilliance while framing Eleanor's contributions as mere clerical work. She was the one who first planted the seed in Richard's mind that he was being held back, that his wife was a relic from his humble past, not a partner for his magnificent future. She saw Eleanor not as the co-creator of their wealth, but as the original, less impressive model of a wife that Richard, now a man of immense status, was entitled to upgrade. When Isabella appeared, young, beautiful, and utterly adoring of Richard's genius, Margaret did not see a homewrecker. She saw a correction, a vindication of her own shallow values. She saw the trophy her son had finally earned. Thus, the betrayal at the anniversary party was not a sudden act. It was the final, inevitable collapse of a structure that had been rotting from the inside for years, weakened by a husband's stolen valor and a mother's venomous pride. Eleanor had been the silent architect of an empire. And now, standing amidst its public ruins, she realized she would have to be the architect of its reckoning as well. A serpent's entry into a garden is rarely announced with a rattle. It comes silently, gliding through the undergrowth, its pattern mistaken for dappled sunlight until it is too late. Isabella Rossi did not storm into the lives of Richard and Eleanor Vance. She seeped in, a subtle and sweet poison. Her arrival at Vancecorp was no accident of a university career fair. It was a targeted strike. Months before her resume landed on the desk of human resources, Isabella had made Richard Vance her singular subject of study. She consumed every article, every interview, every vapid society column that mentioned his name. She learned of his celebrated risk-taking and his private anxieties about being seen as an aging titan in a world of youthful tech billionaires. She understood that to conquer this man, she could not simply appeal to his vanity. She had to become the very embodiment of it. Her approach was a masterclass in psychological warfare. During her internship, she never lingered too long by his office or wore dresses that were conspicuously inappropriate. Instead, she distinguished herself through her work, specifically on projects she knew he personally oversaw. She would submit proposals that were 90% solid, conventional work, but with one or two bold ideas that mirrored the kind of aggressive strategies Richard had been praised for in his youth. Then, she would request a meeting, not to flirt, but to humbly seek the counsel of a true visionary. In his office, surrounded by monuments to his own success, she was the perfect acolyte. She listened with an intensity that bordered on worship, her eyes wide with manufactured admiration as he recounted the well-worn tales of his corporate conquests. "That's what's missing today, Mr. Vance," she'd say, her voice a perfect blend of deference and intellectual fire. "Courage. Everyone is so obsessed with data and safe bets, they've forgotten that empires are built on instinct." She was not offering him affection, she was offering him a reflection of the man he desperately wanted to be again, young, vital, and daring. While this calculated siege was being laid, Eleanor saw only the distant smoke of a battle she did not believe was being fought. The first signs of Richard's transformation were small enough to be dismissed as cliches of a midlife crisis. There was the sudden, almost religious devotion to a new fitness regime, his mornings no longer starting with coffee and the Wall Street Journal, but with a punishing session with a trainer half his age. He traded his classic, tailored suits for slimmer, European cuts in brighter colors, and a new, sharp-smelling cologne replaced the familiar scent he had worn for 2 decades. He started peppering his language with buzzwords picked up from Isabella Synergy, disruption, thinking outside the box, using them with the awkward enthusiasm of a tourist trying out a new language. Eleanor, a woman who valued substance over style, found these changes faintly ridiculous, but not alarming. She saw a man running from his own mortality, and she felt a pang of pity for him, not suspicion. The true warning signs were not in what he did, but in what he stopped doing. For 25 years, their evening conversations had been the true boardroom of Vansacorp. Over dinner, or a glass of wine, they would dissect the day's events, debate strategy, and plan their next moves. Slowly, these conversations dwindled. When Eleanor questioned a risky new venture, a flashy tech startup that Richard was suddenly passionate about, he grew defensive. "You're too cautious, Eleanor," he snapped. "The market has changed. This isn't the slow and steady world we built the company in." He was quoting Isabella's carefully planted rhetoric, using her words to build a wall between himself and his wife. He began to stay late at the office, citing the need to mentor the next generation. Eleanor once called his office at 9 in the evening to discuss a contract, only to be told by a security guard that Mr. Vance and Miss Rossi had left for a dinner meeting hours ago. Even then, Eleanor's mind, so adept at seeing patterns in complex market data, refused to connect these obvious dots. Her trust was her blind spot. She was a logician, and in her logic, their shared history was a colossal asset on their life's balance sheet. It was an investment of 25 years of love, loyalty, and mutual creation. The idea that Richard would liquidate that asset for something as volatile and superficial as a young woman's flattery seemed like a catastrophic business decision, and she simply could not believe him capable of such profound foolishness. She diagnosed his behavior as a temporary affliction, a fever of ego that would eventually break. She focused on her own work, on steering the company through the turbulence his newfound recklessness was creating, believing that her steady hand was what he, and the business, needed. She mistook the silence growing between them for a temporary lull, not the quiet expansion of a fatal chasm. This is the cruelest irony of betrayal. It is often enabled by the very faith of the one who is about to be broken. Eleanor Vance, the architect, who could spot a structural flaw in any blueprint, failed to see that the foundations of her own house had been methodically and deliberately hollowed out, leaving behind nothing but a beautiful, fragile facade, ready to collapse at the slightest touch. The silence that followed Richard's declaration was not empty. It was thick and heavy, filled with the unspoken thoughts of 200 guests. The string quartet, which had been playing a cheerful Vivaldi piece, faltered, one violin squeaking into the void before falling quiet. A waiter, mid-pour, froze, the champagne bottle hovering over a glass. Every eye was a lens, every ear a microphone, capturing the live demolition of a 25-year institution. The soft, romantic fairy lights that adorned the ancient oak trees suddenly felt harsh and accusatory, like the floodlights in a prison yard. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop, holding its breath in anticipation of the explosion that was sure to follow. But the explosion never came from Eleanor. It came, instead, from Richard, who mistook the horrified silence for captivated attention. He raised his hands in a gesture of magnanimous sincerity, a politician calming a crowd. "I know this is unconventional," he said, his voice resonating with a practiced earnestness. "But I could not stand before you all tonight, celebrating a quarter of a century of my life, without being completely honest. Eleanor and I have had a wonderful journey. We built an empire from nothing, and for that, I will always be grateful." He paused, letting the word grateful hang in the air, a pathetic offering to the woman he was publicly crucifying. But people grow, and sometimes they grow apart. To continue living in a way that is not authentic to my own heart would be the greatest dishonesty of all. It would be a disservice to the memory of what we had, and a disservice to Eleanor. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it was a masterpiece of self-deception. He was framing his betrayal as an act of moral courage, his infidelity as a quest for truth. He was not a cheater. He was a pioneer of emotional authenticity. In his narrative, Eleanor was not a victim, but a chapter he had bravely and nobly closed. Across the lawn, his audience reacted in their own silent ways. Isabella, the named catalyst of this destruction, performed her role to perfection. She did not look triumphant. Instead, she brought a delicate hand to her chest, her eyes glistening with what looked like unshed tears. She looked overwhelmed, a fragile flower caught in the storm of a great man's passion. It was a brilliant, subtle performance designed to cast her as a passive recipient of this grand, dramatic love, rather than the active architect of a hostile takeover. Near the Grand Marquis, however, the performance was not so well received. Michael and Olivia Vance felt their father's words like a physical blow. Olivia, a lawyer with her mother's sharp mind, felt a cold fury rise within her. Michael, whose temper was closer to his father's, took an involuntary step forward, his hands clenched into fists. It was Olivia who stopped him, her hand a firm grip on his arm. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, an entire conversation passing between them without a word. An agreement was made. An allegiance was sworn. Together they began to walk across the perfectly manicured lawn, their steps measured and deliberate. They ignored the curious, pitying stares of the guests, their focus entirely on the still, silent figure of their mother. They came to a stop on either side of her, a human shield of loyalty. They said nothing, but their presence was a shout. They had chosen their side. It was this image, Eleanor, flanked by her two fiercely protective children, that spurred the final player into action. Margaret Vance had been observing the scene with a look of profound satisfaction. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The public validation of everything she had always believed. With the grace of a vulture circling its prey, she glided through the paralyzed crowd. She was a vision of matriarchal elegance, her silver hair perfectly styled, her diamonds catching the harsh light. She reached Eleanor and placed a cold, heavily ringed hand on her daughter-in-law's arm. She leaned in, her voice a conspiratorial whisper that was far more venomous than any shout could have been. "Don't you worry, dear," she murmured, her breath smelling of gin and victory. Finally, he realizes his own worth. This should have happened years ago. She gave Eleanor's arm a little pat, a gesture of dismissal disguised as comfort. That was it. That was the moment the ice in Eleanor's veins, which had been slowly forming, froze solid. It was not Richard's betrayal that did it. It was not the collective stare of the crowd. It was the smug, triumphant whisper of the woman who had been a quiet poison in her life for 25 years. In that instant, the shock, the hurt, the humiliation, it all burned away, leaving behind something new. It was a feeling of absolute, crystalline clarity. She saw the chessboard for what it was. She saw Richard, not as a monster, but as a weak, egotistical pawn. She saw Isabella as an ambitious, predictable opponent. And she saw her mother-in-law as the foolish queen who had just made a fatal move. A slow, almost imperceptible change occurred in her expression. The vacant shock was replaced by a focused calm. She turned her head slightly and looked at Margaret, not with pain, but with a cool, unnerving stillness. She gave a single, tiny nod. It was not a nod of defeat or agreement. It was a nod of acknowledgement. A promise. A debt had just been incurred, and Eleanor Vance, the woman who had balanced the books of an empire, always ensured that debts were paid. She then turned, without a single glance back at her husband, and walked towards the house, her children falling into step behind her, a silent, formidable trio leaving a king to celebrate alone in the ruins of his kingdom. The heavy oak door of the study clicked shut, and the world fell away. The muffled, chaotic sounds of the party, a forced resumption of music, the nervous chatter of guests making their hasty exits became a distant, irrelevant hum. Eleanor did not turn on the main lights. She moved through the familiar darkness to her desk, the one place in the sprawling mansion that was unequivocally hers. This room was not decorated for comfort or for show. It was a command center. The walls were lined not with art, but with built-in shelves holding leather-bound volumes on corporate law, economic theory, and architectural history. There were no family photos on her desk, only a sleek, powerful computer terminal and a single, minimalist lamp. She sat down in her worn leather chair, her posture as straight and unyielding as a steel rod. For a full minute, she did nothing. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply breathed. One deep, methodical inhale, followed by a long, slow exhale, purging the last vestiges of the publicly humiliated wife. When she opened her eyes again, the woman who had stood frozen on the lawn was gone. In her place was the architect, the strategist, the founder. Her first move was not to pour a drink or call a friend for comfort. Her fingers moved with quiet purpose to the keyboard, and the screen flickered to life, displaying not a newsfeed or social media, but the intricate, color-coded organizational chart of Vance Corp. She stared at it, her gaze analytical and devoid of sentiment. She was not looking at the tapestry of her life's work. She was a surgeon examining a patient riddled with disease. She saw the bloat, the inefficiencies, the vanity projects Richard had greenlit to stroke his ego, the overpaid executives he'd hired for their loyalty rather than their talent, the dangerous levels of debt he'd taken on to fund his flashy, high-risk ventures. For years, she had been the voice of caution, the steady hand reining him in. Now, seeing it all laid bare, she felt a cold clarity wash over her. The marriage had not just been a personal failure, it had become a catastrophic business liability. Her pain, sharp and profound, was immediately transmuted into data points, into a list of vulnerabilities to be exploited. After an hour of silent analysis, she picked up the secure phone line on her desk and dialed a number she knew by heart. It was answered on the second ring. "Arthur," she said, her voice even and calm. A tired, familiar voice responded. "Eleanor? It's past midnight. Is everything okay?" Arthur Finch was more than her lawyer. He was a friend from her university days, one of the few people who knew the full extent of her contributions to the Vance empire. "Everything is proceeding as anticipated." "Arthur," she replied, the coded language they had established years ago falling easily from her lips. "I need you to open the Henderson file. Full activation. I'll be at your office at 9 a.m. on Monday. I expect the preliminary framework to be in place." There was a pause on the other end, then a heavy sigh, not of surprise, but of grim resignation. "I had hoped you would never have to make this call. The framework is already being prepped." "Eleanor, are you sure?" Her response was instant, cutting through any potential for doubt. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life." After ending the call, she walked to a discreetly placed wall safe hidden behind a framed blueprint of their first successful building. She entered the code, and the heavy door swung open. Inside, nestled between property deeds and stock certificates, was a slim, leather-bound portfolio. She placed it on her desk and opened it. The document on top was not a prenuptial agreement. Richard's ego would never have allowed for one, but something far more powerful, a durable power of attorney for financial matters, signed by Richard J. Vance nearly a decade ago. She remembered the day with perfect clarity. He had been rushing off to a golf tournament, annoyed by the paperwork she had placed in front of him. "It's just to manage the brokerage accounts and pay capital gains taxes when we're in Europe, darling," she had explained calmly. "Arthur says it's standard." He had barely glanced at the dense legal text, scrawling his arrogant signature across the bottom line before jogging out the door. It was a simple, routine document, one that gave her the authority to act on his behalf in almost all financial transactions. It was a gun he had loaded and handed to her himself, never once imagining she would have the reason or the will to pull the trigger. With that document as her legal shield, Eleanor Vance went to war. The first battle was fought in the silent, digital realm before the sun even rose. She wasn't liquidating assets in a panic. Her actions were surgical and precise. First, she logged into the master registry for Vance Corp's intellectual properties. She located the file for the proprietary market analysis software she had personally designed years ago, the very engine that drove the company's acquisition strategy. With a few quiet keystrokes, she legally transferred the full ownership of the software from Vancecorp to a newly formed, anonymous Delaware corporation named Henderson Holdings. Then, she drafted a simple licensing agreement, leasing the software back to Vancecorp for an annual fee. It was a perfectly legal, if unusual, transaction that effectively stripped the company of its most valuable core asset, turning it into a tenant in its own house. Next, she accessed their joint investment portfolios, vast and diversified. She didn't sell the stocks. Instead, she used her authority to pledge a significant portion of them as collateral to secure a massive, short-term line of credit from a private bank in Switzerland, a bank that valued discretion above all else. The money, a staggering sum, was not deposited into an account Richard could see. It was held by Henderson Holdings, a war chest waiting to be deployed. The sun was beginning to cast a pale gray light into the study when she finally leaned back. The house was silent. The guests were gone. The trader was likely asleep in another woman's bed. But Eleanor was wide awake. The shock had passed. The grief had been compartmentalized. What remained was the cold, clean hum of a perfectly executed plan set in motion. The public execution had been his idea, but the silent, methodical dismantling of his world would be hers. While Eleanor was quietly assembling her arsenal in the shadows, Richard Vance was living loudly in the Sunday. He and Isabella had moved out of the grand, traditional Hamptons estate, a house he now described as stuffy and filled with ghosts, and into a starkly modern penthouse overlooking Central Park. It was a space of cold, minimalist beauty with vast glass walls, gleaming white marble floors, and furniture that looked more like sculpture than something meant for human comfort. It was a showroom, not a home. A perfect stage for the new life he was so desperate to perform. Their first few months were a whirlwind of curated bliss, a frantic pageant of youth and wealth played out for the benefit of the paparazzi and society bloggers. There were impulsive trips to Monaco on a chartered jet, front-row seats at Paris Fashion Week, and lavish parties in their new apartment where the champagne flowed as freely as the vapid conversation. Richard was spending money with a reckless abandon he hadn't displayed since his 20s, buying Isabella extravagant gifts, a canary yellow Ferrari, a breathtaking collection of emeralds, a controlling stake in a fledgling fashion label she fancied. He was not just spending money on her, he was spending it on himself, trying to purchase a younger, more vital version of Richard Vance. But the gloss of this new life was thin, and beneath it, the reality was stark and hollow. The first cracks in the gilded cage appeared during the quiet moments, the ones that couldn't be filled with parties or shopping. Richard was, at his core, a man of business. His passion, his language, was the art of the deal. He was accustomed to coming home to Eleanor, to dissecting a difficult negotiation or brainstorming a new strategy with a partner who understood the stakes, whose mind was as sharp, if not sharper, than his own. One evening, he returned to the penthouse, agitated but exhilarated by a complex zoning issue that was threatening $1 billion development. He launched into an explanation, pacing the marble floor, expecting Isabella to listen, to engage, perhaps even offer a fresh perspective. She, however, was reclining on a severe white sofa, languidly scrolling through her tablet. "That sounds stressful, baby," she murmured, without looking up. "Did you see the new Birkin they released? The Himalayan crocodile. It's to die for." Richard stopped pacing. The energy, the excitement, drained out of him, leaving a cold, empty feeling in its place. He had traded a partner for an audience, and a profoundly distracted one at that. This intellectual void was compounded by the relentless financial drain. Isabella's desires were a bottomless pit. She viewed his fortune not as a resource to be managed, but as a magical, infinite wellspring for her whims. She hired a notoriously expensive interior decorator who insisted on ripping out the kitchen's brand new Italian fixtures to replace them with slightly different, even more expensive Italian fixtures. Her circle of friends, a flock of equally beautiful and vacuous socialites, were a constant presence, treating the penthouse like their own private club, ordering cases of vintage wine, and leaving Richard to quietly pick up the astronomical tabs. At first, he found it intoxicating, a testament to his power and success. But soon, the sheer scale of the spending began to register. The monthly statements from his personal accounts, which he had not properly scrutinized in years, were now filled with staggering figures from designer boutiques and five-star resorts. A small, unfamiliar knot of anxiety began to form in his stomach, a feeling he quickly crushed. He was Richard Vance. The money would never run out. While his personal wealth was being siphoned away, the source of that wealth, Vance Corp, began to show signs of sickness. The problems were small at first, like a series of paper cuts. A trusted construction supplier of 15 years suddenly defaulted on a contract, citing unforeseen logistical issues, causing a costly delay on a key project. A promising young executive he'd poached from a rival firm quit after just 6 months, complaining of a chaotic and unfocused corporate culture. Then, a notice arrived from the IT department about a significant new annual expenditure, a licensing fee for their core market analysis software. Richard, buried in other problems, barely glanced at it, simply cursing the tech consultants for finding another way to fleece him. He never thought to question who owned the license. He was the captain of a ship, and he was so busy scanning the horizon for icebergs that he failed to notice that someone was quietly pulling the plugs from beneath the waterline. He blamed the market. He blamed his new COO, a man he'd promoted for his sycophancy rather than his skill. He blamed the lingering influence of Eleanor's outdated, overly cautious methods. His ego, a fortress of denial, made it impossible for him to consider the truth, that these were not random acts of misfortune, but coordinated, strategic strikes. The hollowness of his new life was never more apparent than when he was surrounded by Isabella's world. She dragged him to a gallery opening in a hip, downtown neighborhood. The art was incomprehensible, the music was a deafening electronic pulse, and he was a full generation older than anyone else in the room. He stood awkwardly by the bar, holding a drink he didn't want, while Isabella flitted from group to group, laughing and embracing her friends. They would give him a cursory nod, their eyes glazing over the moment he tried to engage them in conversation. He was not a person to them. He was a brand, the rich old guy who funded their friend's lifestyle. He watched her across the crowded room, a beautiful, vibrant creature in her natural habitat, and he had never felt more ancient or more alone. He had traded the warmth of a shared history for the cold, fleeting thrill of being adjacent to youth. He had everything he thought he wanted: the beautiful young woman, the adoring public, the freedom from his boring old life. He had built himself a cage of pure gold, and he was only just beginning to realize that, for all its glitter, it offered neither comfort nor freedom. It was just a cage. The bonds of family, Richard Vance had always believed, were forged in the currency of his success. The private schools, the European vacations, the trust funds, these were the pillars of his children's affection, and he assumed their loyalty, like any other asset, was his to command. It was this profound miscalculation that led him to agree, almost eagerly, to a meeting with Michael and Olivia. They had requested to see him, and he imagined they were crawling back, their principles softened by the harsh reality of a reduced allowance. He chose his gleaming new penthouse as the venue, a sterile, white stage upon which he could display the splendor of his new life, a clear message that his world was moving forward, with or without them. When they arrived, however, he felt the first flicker of unease. They were not contrite or emotional. They entered the apartment together, a united front, their expressions composed and serious. They looked at the minimalist decor, the panoramic views, and the expensive, impersonal art with a quiet disdain. They were not there to be intimidated. They were there as emissaries from a life he had discarded. Isabella was conveniently absent, a detail Eleanor's children had insisted upon. They sat opposite their father in the vast living room, the space between them feeling like a courtroom. Olivia, ever the lawyer, spoke first, her voice calm and measured, which was somehow more damning than any shout would have been. "We asked for this meeting, Dad, because we wanted to say this to you directly," she began, her hands folded in her lap. "What you did to Mom was not just a divorce. It was a public assassination of her character and a desecration of 25 years of partnership. You didn't just leave her, you tried to humiliate her, to erase her, and in doing so, you humiliated us." Richard shifted in his seat, his face tightening. "This is a private matter between your mother and me. It has nothing to do with you." Olivia's gaze did not waver. "When you build a family, nothing is a private matter. You made it public. You stood on a stage and disavowed the woman who built that stage for you. We are here to tell you that we will not stand by and applaud. We will not welcome Isabella into our lives. We will not pretend that this is normal or acceptable. We stand with Mom." Richard scoffed, a bitter, dismissive sound. "Your mother has poisoned you against me." That was the opening Michael was waiting for. He leaned forward, his expression a mixture of anger and genuine pity. "No, Dad, you did this. Mom hasn't said a single bad word about you. She hasn't had to. We have eyes," he said, his voice rising with a passion Olivia had kept in check. "I still have friends at Vansicorp. Do you have any idea what they're saying? They're not impressed, they're disgusted. They see a man in a desperate midlife crisis, not a leader. You're becoming a joke. You've traded your most valuable advisor for her," he said, gesturing vaguely around the apartment that was so clearly Isabella's territory. "You're damaging the company, you're destroying our family, and you're too blind to see it." This struck a nerve. To attack his business acumen was to attack the very core of his identity. Richard's face flushed with a deep, crimson anger. "How dare you?" he seethed, rising to his feet. "Everything you have, your education, your cars, the clothes on your back, it came from me. From my work, my risks, my genius." He began to pace, his voice booming in the cavernous room. "I have given you everything, and your loyalty lasts all of 5 minutes? You side with a woman who was content to live in my shadow against the man who built the entire world you live in?" He stopped and pointed a trembling finger at them. "This is the deal. There is no more negotiation. You accept my life. You accept Isabella. You show me the respect I am owed as your father, or you are out. No more trust fund, no more monthly allowance, no more Vansicorp email address, Michael. You will be on your own. So you choose. You choose me, or you choose nothing." He stood there, panting slightly, convinced that this display of raw power, this financial ultimatum, was the checkmate move. He had expected them to falter, to see the practical, terrifying reality of his threat. Instead, he saw only resolve. Michael and Olivia looked at each other, a silent confirmation of a decision they had already made long ago. It was Olivia who spoke, her voice still quiet, but now laced with a finality that chilled him to the bone. "We choose Mom," she said simply. They both stood up. "And for the record," Michael added, looking around the sterile white room one last time, "this is nothing. We're choosing the only thing of value you ever had." They turned and walked out of the penthouse, the heavy door clicking shut behind them, leaving Richard Vance utterly, profoundly alone, a king who had just banished the last of his loyal subjects. Later that evening, Michael and Olivia sat in the warm, familiar kitchen of the Hamptons' house. The scent of Eleanor's cooking, something they hadn't realized they missed so much, filled the air. They recounted the confrontation, their voices a mixture of sadness and relief. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression betraying only a deep sorrow for the pain her children were being forced to endure. She did not celebrate her victory. When they finished, she came over and placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "He gave you an impossible choice," she said softly, "and you made the only honorable one. I am proud of you both. But I need you to know," she continued, her voice firming with resolve, "you are not on your own. You are not choosing nothing." She led them to her study and showed them the documents she and Arthur had prepared. She had already established new, independent trusts for both of them, funded by the assets she had strategically relocated. Their financial security was completely severed from Richard's control. "Your father thinks money is his only power," she said, looking at her children, her true legacy. "He is about to learn that real power lies in loyalty. You are my partners now. We will protect what we built. Together." In his rage, Richard had sought to isolate and punish his children. Instead, he had armed his enemy with her most powerful weapons. For months, Richard Vance had been fighting ghosts. He saw the company's declining profits and blamed a bearish market. He saw the worried faces of his senior staff and blamed a culture of disloyalty. He saw the tabloid pictures of himself stumbling out of a nightclub with Isabella and blamed a vindictive press. He was a man swinging wildly in the dark, never once suspecting that his opponent was not a ghost, but a ghostwriter, the very woman who had authored his success and was now meticulously plotting his failure. While he was distracted by the glittering surfaces of his new life, Eleanor, through her discreet holding company, was waging a silent, patient war. Henderson Holdings, an unknown entity to the market, had been methodically acquiring Vancecorp assets. It bought shares from institutional investors who were growing nervous about Richard's erratic leadership. It purchased bundles of the company's corporate debt from secondary lenders. By the time autumn leaves began to fall in Central Park, Eleanor, through her corporate veil, controlled a formidable 12% of the company she had founded. It was time to move out of the shadows. The Vancecorp quarterly board meeting was a somber affair. The numbers were bleak, and the mood in the mahogany-paneled boardroom was tense. Richard, looking tired and irritable, was in the middle of a rambling, defensive monologue, trying to spin the dismal results into a narrative of future growth when the heavy double doors at the end of the room swung open. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was Eleanor Vance. She was not the demure society wife they remembered. She was dressed in a charcoal gray suit with severe, clean lines, her hair pulled back in a tight, elegant chignon. She looked less like a woman scorned and more like a prosecutor arriving at a trial. Flanked by her lawyer, Arthur Finch, her presence sucked the air out of the room. Richard stared, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. "What is the meaning of this?" he sputtered, his voice cracking. "This is a closed meeting." "Security." Before any move could be made, Arthur Finch stepped forward, his demeanor calm and implacable. He addressed the chairman of the board, a stoic, old-money patriarch named Charles Peterson. "Mr. Calm." "Chairman, my apologies for the interruption. We are here on behalf of our client, Henderson Holdings, a significant shareholder in this corporation." He placed a sleek portfolio on the table, containing irrefutable proof of their 12% stake. A murmur of shock rippled through the room. Furthermore, Arthur continued, his voice cutting through the noise, pursuant to Vancecorp Bylaw 7, Section 4, which states that any shareholder with a stake exceeding 10% may call for an immediate review of executive performance in the event of gross financial mismanagement. We are formally calling for such a review. Now. Richard shot to his feet. "This is absurd. That clause is for a genuine corporate crisis." "We believe we are in one," Eleanor said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was quiet, cold, and carried more authority than Richard's shout. She looked directly at Peterson. "The bylaws you all ratified 20 years ago are quite clear. I should know. I wrote them." Peterson, a man who valued procedure above all else, looked at the documents, then at his own copy of the bylaws. He sighed. She is correct. The meeting will be suspended. Mrs. Vance, you have the floor. What followed was not an emotional tirade, but a clinical, brutal dissection. Eleanor did not speak of betrayal or infidelity. She spoke of numbers, the only language the men in that room truly respected. She connected her laptop to the overhead projector, and the wall behind Richard was filled with a series of damning charts. The first showed Vance Corp's stock performance, a healthy, climbing line that suddenly took a nosedive, the inflection point aligning perfectly with the date of the anniversary party. This is the precise moment market confidence in our CEO began to collapse, she stated calmly. She moved to the next slide, a breakdown of a major construction project that was now 3 months behind schedule and millions over budget. This delay can be traced back to the sudden, inexplicable loss of our primary materials supplier, a partner of 15 years. What steps were taken to maintain this crucial relationship? She asked, looking directly at Richard. She presented the failed financing for the Boston deal, framing it as evidence that Richard's increasingly unstable personal brand was making long-term lenders nervous. The final slide was her masterpiece. It was a list of new, unbudgeted corporate expenditures from the last quarter. Highlighted in bright red was the substantial licensing fee being paid to an unknown entity for the company's own proprietary software. Henderson Holdings, Eleanor announced, is now the legal owner of this essential intellectual property. And as the new owners, we are deeply concerned as to why the CEO would allow the company's most valuable asset to be transferred out of its control with no discernible benefit to the shareholders. It was a lie wrapped in a truth, a brilliant piece of corporate theater. She had created the problem and was now demanding the CEO account for it. Richard was apoplectic. He stammered, he blustered, he blamed disgruntled employees and a hostile market. He had no data, only rage. He looked like a cornered, confused animal, while Eleanor looked like the calm, prepared hunter. The board members watched, their faces grim. They were not watching a domestic dispute. They were watching their investments burn on the pyre of one man's ego. After a grueling 45 minutes, Chairman Peterson called for a recess, asking both Richard and Eleanor to wait outside. In the hallway, Richard rounded on her, his face contorted. "You snake," he hissed. "This is what this was always about, wasn't it? The money." Eleanor didn't even grant him a glance. She stared at the wall ahead, her expression unreadable. "This is about competence, Richard," she said without turning. "You are no longer competent." When they were called back into the room, the verdict was swift. Charles Peterson looked at Richard, his expression devoid of sympathy. "Richard, the board has voted to place you on an indefinite leave of absence, effective immediately. We are launching a full, independent audit into the matters raised today. In the interim, Mr. Hayes," he said, nodding to the quiet, efficient COO, "will assume the duties of CEO." It was a corporate execution. Richard stood there, stunned into silence, as Eleanor and Arthur gathered their things. She had not raised her voice. She had not shed a tear. She had used the system he loved, the cold, unforgiving logic of business, to decapitate him. As she walked out of the building she had helped create, she did not feel a rush of triumph. She felt only the quiet, satisfying click of the first, heavy domino falling precisely into place. The removal from Vance Corp was not a suspension for Richard, it was an amputation. The company had been more than a job. It was the source of his identity, the engine of his ego. Without the title of CEO, without the boardroom to command and the underlings to impress, he was simply a man, and he was horrified by how little that seemed to be. The vast, white penthouse that had once felt like a symbol of his freedom now felt like a prison. His days became a long, featureless landscape of aimless wandering. He would stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows for hours, watching the bustling city below, a world he no longer felt a part of. He drank. He started with expensive scotch in the afternoon and often ended with cheap whiskey late at night. The easy charm that had been his trademark curdled into a bitter, resentful snarl. He picked fights with Isabella over trivialities, The music she played, the friends she invited over, the sheer, vibrant, unapologetic youth that now seemed to mock his own forced obsolescence. The gilded cage had become a pressure cooker, and the man inside was beginning to unravel. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. The argument had been particularly vicious. Isabella, dressed to go out, had announced she was tired of sitting around this mausoleum and was going for cocktails with friends. Richard, 3 glasses of scotch deep, had exploded. He accused her of being a shallow gold digger, of abandoning him now that things were difficult. His face was flushed, a vein throbbing in his temple as he shouted, the words slurring together from alcohol and rage. And then, in the middle of a syllable, it happened. A sudden, blinding flash of pain behind his right eye, as if a lightning bolt had struck the inside of his skull. The room tilted violently. He reached out for a chair to steady himself, but his left arm would not obey the command. It hung limp and useless at his side. He tried to speak, to call her name, but the words that came out were a thick, garbled mess, a terrifying parody of language. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him as he realized what was happening. He was losing control. His body, the one thing he had been working so hard to preserve, was betraying him. He staggered, crashing into a glass coffee table, and slid to the cold marble floor. The last thing he saw before his vision blurred was Isabella's face, her expression not one of concern, but of stark, theatrical horror, as if she were witnessing a priceless vase shatter at her feet. When Richard awoke, the world had been muted and tilted. The sharp, sterile smell of a hospital filled his nostrils. He was alive, but a part of him was gone. A team of solemn-faced doctors explained the diagnosis. A massive ischemic stroke. The prognosis was uncertain. He had significant motor impairment on his left side and severe aphasia, a condition that tangled the pathways between thought and speech. He was trapped, a functioning mind entombed in a broken body. Isabella's performance as the devoted partner lasted approximately 48 hours. During the initial crisis, she played the part, wringing her hands and speaking to doctors with a furrowed brow. But once the immediate drama subsided, her patience evaporated. Her hospital visits became shorter, more perfunctory. She spent most of the time pacing in the hallway, speaking into her phone in a loud, aggrieved whisper. "I can't believe this is happening to me," she lamented to a friend. "My entire life is on hold. He just lies there. It's so grotesque." When he was finally discharged back to the penthouse, the true nature of his new reality became brutally clear. He was an inconvenience, a piece of broken furniture that had ruined the aesthetic of her perfect life. A home health aide was hired to deal with the unpleasant realities of his care. Isabella, meanwhile, engaged in what she called retail therapy to cope with the trauma of it all. The spending, which had been extravagant before, now became manic. She saw his helplessness not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. With Richard unable to scrutinize statements or question her purchases, she began to systematically drain his liquid assets. "Honey, I need you to sign this," she would coo, pushing a pen into his functional right hand and guiding it across a document he couldn't possibly comprehend. "It's just to give me access to the household accounts to pay for all these medical things." The money was transferred not to doctors, but to a private savings account in her name only. She was a scavenger, picking the bones clean before the carcass was even cold. Richard's mother, Margaret, offered no solace. She swept into the penthouse a week after his return, expecting a scene of quiet, dignified convalescence. Instead, she was confronted with the grim, unglamorous truth of a stroke victim. She saw the wheelchair, the slight droop of his mouth, the frustration in his eyes as he struggled to form a simple word. She recoiled. Her visits were a torment of useless fussing and theatrical weeping. She would rearrange his pillows, complain about the smell of disinfectant, and get into shrill, whispered arguments with Isabella in the hallway about who was more devastated by the tragedy. She was incapable of providing any practical comfort. She was a woman built for cocktail parties and charity galas, not for the stark, terrifying reality of illness and mortality. Her presence only amplified Richard's sense of utter isolation. He was surrounded by 2 women who had been drawn to his power like moths to a flame. Now that the light had been extinguished, they were simply fluttering around in a panic, repulsed by the darkness. He would lie in his bed for hours, the television flickering meaninglessly in the corner, and for the first time in his life, he was forced into silence. In that silence, he could only think. He thought of the empire he had lost, the children he had banished, and the woman who had been his partner in every storm, a woman whose name he could no longer properly say, a woman he had thrown away for this hollow, echoing cage. While Richard lay trapped in the silent prison of his own body, the company he had helmed for a quarter of a century was being systematically dissected. The independent audit, initiated by Eleanor's strategic strike, was a bloodbath. The auditors, a notoriously meticulous firm, uncovered years of Richard's profligate spending, his questionable deals, and the network of incompetent cronies he had installed in key positions. The board of directors was in a state of controlled panic. Their legendary CEO was not a visionary. He was a liability, and they were preparing to sever all ties, to fire him for cause and attempt to salvage what was left of the company's tattered reputation. It was on the eve of this decision that Arthur Finch requested one final emergency session with the board. He told the chairman, Charles Peterson, that his client had a proposal that would not just salvage Vansacorp, but secure its future. The board, desperate for a lifeline, agreed. The atmosphere in the boardroom was even more grim than before. These were men facing financial ruin and public humiliation. They sat in stony silence as Eleanor entered, once again dressed in severe, commanding business attire. This time, she carried something with her, a large, worn leather portfolio, its corners softened with age. She placed it in the center of the polished mahogany table, and the quiet, solid thud seemed to shake the room. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice cutting through the tension, "the audit has shown you that this company is sick, but the disease is far older and more malignant than you imagine. The entire foundation of Vansacorp is a fraud." She untied the leather straps of the portfolio and carefully unrolled a large, yellowed sheet of drafting paper. It was a brilliant, intricate architectural design for a waterfront skyscraper, a design every person in the room recognized instantly. It was the blueprint for the Vance Tower, the iconic building that had launched the company into the stratosphere. But as the board members leaned in to look closer, they saw that the elegant script in the title block did not read Vance Tower. It read Henderson Waterfront Project. And the signature in the bottom right-hand corner was not Richard J. Vance, but Charles M. Henderson, dated 2 years before Eleanor had even met her future husband. A wave of shock and disbelief washed over the room. Before they could fully process it, Eleanor produced a small, leather-bound journal. "This was my father's," she said, her voice steady. "He was a brilliant architect, but a terrible businessman. He died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving behind a drawer full of dreams." She opened the journal to a marked page and read aloud. "The glass facade will catch the morning sun, making it look like a silver needle stitching the river to the sky. It's not just a building. It's a statement of hope, of reaching for something better." The simple, earnest words of a dead man echoed in the sterile boardroom, a voice from the grave testifying to a theft that had occurred a generation ago. Eleanor closed the journal. "A young, ambitious intern worked at my father's small firm. An intern who was known for his charm, but not for his talent. An intern who helped my widowed mother clear out his office after his death. That intern, of course, was Richard Vance." As the full, horrifying implication of her words settled, the boardroom doors opened and Arthur Finch escorted in a frail, elderly man with sharp, intelligent eyes. "This is Professor Alistair Finch," Arthur announced. "Former partner at Henderson and Finch Architecture, and my uncle." The professor, armed with a sworn affidavit, spoke in a clear, unwavering voice. He testified that the designs were unequivocally the work of his late partner, Charles Henderson. He recounted how, weeks after Henderson's tragic death, Richard Vance had quit the firm, claiming he was starting his own venture. A year later, the city was buzzing about a brilliant new skyscraper being built by a rising star named Richard Vance. "I always knew," the professor said, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the board members. "I knew the boy had no talent of his own, but I had no proof. Until now. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Arthur Finch stepped forward to deliver the legal coup de grace. "As you can now plainly see," he began, his tone cold and clinical, "the seminal asset upon which this entire corporation was built is stolen property. As Charles Henderson's sole heir, Mrs. Vance is the legal owner of that intellectual property. She has the right to sue Vancecorp for every dollar of profit derived from this design and all its subsequent variations over the past 25 years, adjusted for inflation. Our preliminary calculations put that figure in the tens of billions. It would not just bankrupt the company, it would dissolve it into dust." The board members looked ashen. They were ruined. Then Eleanor spoke again, her voice now the only source of power in the room. "But I have no interest in destroying the livelihoods of this company's innocent employees," she said. "So I am offering you a path to survival, a choice. You will vote to transfer a 90% controlling interest of all corporate shares, including the entirety of the Vance family's frozen holdings, to Henderson Holdings. This is not a negotiation. In exchange, I will legally sign over all rights to my father's designs, saving you from total annihilation. You can either tether your fortunes to a disgraced thief lying helpless in a hospital bed, or you can align with the woman who holds the power to save you. You have 5 minutes." The vote was a mere formality, a unanimous act of self-preservation. When it was done, Eleanor slid one final document across the table to the chairman. It was a corporate resolution. "Effective immediately, the name of this company will be changed to Henderson Holdings," she announced. "The Vance name is to be scrubbed from every building, every letterhead, every sign. His legacy is over. She had won. She had not only seized his kingdom and his fortune, she had taken his name, erasing him from the history he had stolen, and replacing it with the name of the man he had wronged all those years ago. It was a perfect, silent, and complete checkmate. The fall of the House of Vance was not a quiet affair. In the cutthroat world of high finance, it was a seismic event, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and private clubs. The news that Vancecorp was built on a foundation of intellectual theft and its subsequent rebranding to Henderson Holdings was a scandal of epic proportions. The story had everything: greed, betrayal, a forgotten genius, and a brilliant, wronged woman reclaiming her legacy. But while the world feasted on the drama, the principal actors in the tragedy were quietly meeting their individual fates. For them, the aftermath of Eleanor's justice was a slow, grim, and deeply personal reckoning. Isabella Rossi was the first to flee the sinking ship. She saw the news on a financial channel while a personal shopper was laying out diamond bracelets for her inspection. The moment she understood that the Vance name and the infinite credit line attached to it was now worthless, she moved with the swift, amoral efficiency of a true predator. She returned to the penthouse, not to comfort the man she had professed to love, but to liquidate her assets. While Richard watched from his wheelchair, his eyes wide with a pleading, desperate confusion, she moved through the apartment like a whirlwind. She stuffed jewelry into designer handbags, emptied the safe of the cash she had been siphoning for months, and packed only the most expensive, easily transportable clothes. He tried to speak, his mouth forming garbled, agonizing sounds, but she did not even grant him the dignity of a response. As she stood by the door, surrounded by her loot, she finally looked at him, not with pity, but with the flat, dismissive stare one gives a bad investment. "It was fun while it lasted, Richard," she said with a shrug. "But this isn't my brand." Then she was gone, a ghost of a life he had paid for in full, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume and the profound silence of his ruin. For Margaret Vance, the downfall was a different kind of death. Her identity was woven from the fabric of her son's success. She was not Margaret. She was the mother of the great Richard Vance. When his name turned to ash, so did she. The society pages that had once chronicled her every move now detailed her son's disgrace. The invitations to galas and charity luncheons stopped arriving. The friends who had once clamored for her attention now crossed the street to avoid her. She was a social leper, a living reminder of a spectacular fall from grace. Within 6 months, She was forced to sell her lavish Fifth Avenue apartment and its contents to pay off the debts she had accumulated. She moved into a small, anonymous condo in a less fashionable part of the city, surrounded by the ghosts of a life she could no longer access. Her punishment was not poverty, but irrelevance. She was left with nothing but time to contemplate how the shallow values she had instilled in her son had ultimately led to the destruction of them both. Richard's fate was perhaps the cruelest. After the penthouse was seized by the new Henderson Holdings board as a corporate asset, he was quietly moved. With his personal accounts emptied by Isabella and his corporate assets frozen, he was left with a pittance. He was placed in a respectable but grimly institutional, long-term care facility north of the city. His room was small and beige, with a sealed window that overlooked a parking lot. His life, once a symphony of power and prestige, was now reduced to a monotonous, humiliating routine. The strained sessions with a physical therapist, the bland, pureed meals, the long, silent afternoons spent staring at a television he barely registered. The man who once commanded thousands was now utterly dependent on the detached professionalism of overworked nurses. He had no visitors. His mother was consumed by her own social death. His children were building a new empire with his ex-wife. He was a king in exile, stripped of his subjects, his wealth, and his voice. He was left with only his thoughts, a tormenting loop of his own catastrophic mistakes, a silent scream in a body that would not obey. In stark contrast, a new dawn was breaking at the company headquarters in Manhattan. Eleanor Vance, now chairman and CEO of Henderson Holdings, moved through the building with a quiet, confident authority. There was no gloating, no victory tour. There was only work to be done. Her first act was to call a company-wide town hall. Standing before the thousands of anxious employees, she spoke not of the past, but of the future. She laid out a clear, brilliant vision for the company, one based on innovation, stability, and integrity. She assured them that their jobs were secure, that the sickness was confined to the executive suite, and that the cure had been administered. A palpable sense of relief and renewed purpose filled the grand atrium. As she left the stage, she walked through the lobby. High above, on a scaffold, workmen were carefully prying the large gilded letters spelling Vance from the marble wall. She didn't stop to watch the symbolic execution. Her gaze was already fixed on the path ahead. At her side were her children. Olivia was now the head of the legal department, her sharp mind tasked with undoing the tangled web of Richard's bad deals. Michael, having found his purpose, was made chief of operations, his pragmatic, steady hand essential to restoring efficiency. They were not just her children, they were her most trusted colleagues, the co-founders of a new dynasty built on the reclaimed rubble of the old one. Eleanor's justice was not a fiery, passionate storm. It was a cold, precise, and total recalibration. She had not sought to destroy, she had sought to correct. The accounts of the past had been settled, the books were balanced, and a new ledger was now open. 2 years passed. In the world outside Richard Vance's window, the name Henderson Holdings had become a byword for stability and intelligent growth. Eleanor, with Michael and Olivia at her side, had not only salvaged the company, she had elevated it, earning the quiet, profound respect of the world that had once celebrated her husband's bluster. Inside the Northwood Convalescent Center, however, time had stood still. Richard's world was a small, beige room, a wheelchair, and a window overlooking a parking lot. He had regained some limited speech and partial use of his left side, but he was a ghost, a hollowed-out relic of the man he had been. Then one day, the door to his room opened, and his static world was broken. It was Eleanor. She looked the same, poised and untouchable, a visitor from a different universe. Richard's heart hammered in his chest. In 2 years, she had not called, not written, not acknowledged his existence. He stared at her, a mess of conflicting emotions churning within him. Shame, anger, and a pathetic, desperate hope for a crumb of pity. He assumed she had come to see the final product of her work, to gloat over the full extent of his ruin. She did not speak of the past. She sat in the vinyl visitor's chair, her posture as impeccable as ever, and placed a tablet on the rolling bedside table. "Hello, Richard," she said, her voice neutral. She tapped the screen and slid the device towards him. It displayed a gallery of glossy photos from a society website. The images showed Isabella Rossi, more beautiful than ever, draped on the arm of a man who was almost cartoonishly old and wealthy, a Russian oligarch with a face like a crumpled banknote. The headline read, "Third time's the charm? Isabella Rossi weds energy tycoon." Richard looked at the photos, a bitter, familiar ache rising in his throat. He already knew. He had seen a similar picture on the communal television a few months ago. He made a guttural sound, a noise of weary acknowledgement, as if to say, "Yes, I know, I was a fool." He thought this was her checkmate, the final, cruel twist of the knife, to show him what his great love had truly been worth. But Eleanor slowly shook her head. "That isn't why I am here," she said, her voice dropping to a lower, more serious register. "I didn't come to show you that she was unfaithful to you. I came to tell you that she was never faithful to begin with." Richard looked at her, confused. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "My corporate intelligence team flagged Isabella the month she started as an intern. Her resume was a little too perfect, her ambition a little too pointed. We discovered she had been cultivated by a rival firm, a competitor who has wanted a piece of our company for a decade. Her entire purpose was to get close to you, to exploit your weaknesses, destabilize your focus, and soften the company up for a hostile takeover." Richard's mind, foggy from medication and despair, struggled to grasp the words. He was trying to process the idea that his grand passion was nothing but a corporate espionage plot. But the final, devastating truth was yet to come. "I could have had her fired, Richard," Eleanor continued, her eyes as cold and clear as ice. "I could have warned you. I could have saved our marriage." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle in the sterile room. "But I chose not to." Richard's breath hitched. "I saw you. I saw your ego, your desperate need to feel young again, your growing resentment of me. And I realized that our rival's clumsy, predictable little plot had in fact handed me the most perfect tool imaginable. They gave me a stage, and they gave me a script for your downfall that the entire world would understand and even sympathize with." The heartbroken wife. She stood up, looking down at the broken man in the wheelchair. "Your affair was not the event that destroyed our life together, Richard. It was simply the public excuse I needed to execute a plan I had been preparing for years, a plan to take back what you stole from my father. I let it happen. I watched you fall into a trap you were too arrogant to see, a trap I simply opened the door to. You thought you were the master of your destiny, choosing a new life. In reality, you were a pawn, and your predictable weakness was the cornerstone of my entire strategy." He was left shattered, speechless, the entire narrative of his life recast in a single, horrifying moment. He was not a king who had made a tragic mistake. He had been a puppet from the start, his strings pulled by the silent, patient woman he had so foolishly underestimated. Eleanor walked to the door, her purpose for the visit fulfilled. She had come not for revenge, but for closure, to ensure he understood the full and complete truth of his own irrelevance in the grand scheme of his own destruction. She paused, her hand on the doorknob, and delivered her final verdict. "Never mistake the silence of a person who has endured for too long. It is not forgiveness. It is the careful, meticulous calibration of a debt that will, in the end, always be paid in full." She left, closing the door softly behind her, leaving him alone with the rubble of a life he hadn't even truly lived. Eleanor Vance had her justice, a dish served not just cold, but frozen to its very core. She had reclaimed her father's name and built a true empire from the ashes of a false one. But what is the cost of such perfect, icy revenge? What becomes of a heart that must turn to stone to survive? That perhaps is a different story altogether. Join us next time for another tale from US.